Don't waste an operating room on people who can't pay. The words sliced through the emergency department louder than the alarms echoing beneath the bright white ceiling of Johns Hopkins Hospital in Baltimore, Maryland. Every conversation stopped. Every pair of eyes turned toward the trauma entrance where 16-year-old Malcolm Brooks stood frozen beside a rolling stretcher, his trembling hand wrapped tightly around his little sister's fingers. 12-year-old Amara Brooks struggled to breathe, her skin unusually pale beneath the fluorescent lights, while cardiac monitors produced uneven tones that bounced across polished tile floors. Outside, cold November rain hammered against the glass entrance, soaking Malcolm's hoodie and worn jeans as paramedics rushed around him, carrying equipment worth more money than his father earned in months driving city buses across Baltimore. Malcolm swallowed hard and looked directly at the tall man wearing a navy surgical coat, embroidered with the name Dr. Ethan Whitmore. The famous cardiovascular surgeon barely looked at Amara before flipping through the intake paperwork with practiced speed. "Insurance?" he asked without emotion. Malcolm hesitated. "We're applying for emergency assistance." "Please, sir. My sister collapsed at school. She needs surgery." "Doctor." Whitmore's expression never changed. "This isn't a free clinic." Malcolm stepped closer despite the security guard shifting beside him. "Please listen to me. Her symptoms don't match viral myocarditis. Her inflammatory markers probably triggered coronary microvascular failure. If you run another echocardiogram and check for endothelial collapse, you'll see." Whitmore finally looked up, his blue eyes narrowing with disbelief. "How old are you?" 16. "Then stop pretending you're a physician." Several nurses exchanged uncomfortable glances. One young resident quietly stared at Malcolm, noticing the notebook tucked beneath his arm. Its pages overflowed with handwritten biochemical equations, molecular sketches, and carefully organized treatment pathways. Malcolm wasn't guessing. He believed every word he was saying. Amara reached weakly toward him. "Mal," she whispered, barely audible above the machines. Malcolm squeezed her hand. "I'm right here, Amy. You're going to be okay, doctor." Whitmore exhaled impatiently. Security. A tall officer approached cautiously. Malcolm's heartbeat thundered inside his ears. "Sir, please, just give her another scan. 5 minutes. That's all I'm asking." Whitmore folded the chart. "Young man, medicine is built on evidence, not desperation." Malcolm shook his head. "Evidence is exactly what I'm trying to show you." "Enough." Whitmore turned toward another physician. "Move her to observation until billing verifies eligibility." Malcolm felt every word land heavier than the last. Observation. Not surgery. Not treatment. Waiting. He knew waiting could destroy everything. He had spent countless nights reading medical journals from the National Library of Medicine after finishing homework under the weak kitchen light in their apartment on North Avenue. While other teenagers memorized football statistics, Malcolm studied genetic mutations, inflammatory pathways, and experimental therapies from research hospitals across America. Biology wasn't just his favorite subject. It was the language that made sense when life never had. Ever since their mother died from an undiagnosed autoimmune illness 6 years earlier, Malcolm promised himself he would never stand helplessly beside another hospital bed. Yet here he was again. Rainwater dripped from his sleeves onto the spotless hospital floor as another monitor emitted a warning tone. A nurse quietly leaned toward Whitmore. "Doctor, maybe we should at least repeat the imaging." Whitmore didn't slow his pace. "We've already spent enough resources." Malcolm stared at him in disbelief. "You're making a decision because we're poor." Whitmore stopped walking but didn't turn around immediately. The hallway became unnaturally still. Visitors lowered their voices. Residents pretended to study their tablets while secretly listening. Finally, Whitmore looked back over his shoulder. "I'm making a decision based on reality." Malcolm's jaw tightened. Reality doesn't care how much money someone has. For the first time, something flickered across Whitmore's face. Not guilt, not compassion, only irritation that someone wearing soaked sneakers had challenged his authority inside his own hospital. He opened his mouth to respond, but before another word could leave his lips, frantic footsteps echoed from the opposite corridor. A nurse sprinted toward the emergency desk. Her face drained of color as she shouted, "Dr. Whitmore, your son just collapsed at the Science Awards downtown. EMS is bringing him here now." The entire emergency department fell silent. The words hit Dr. Ethan Whitmore harder than any diagnosis he had ever delivered. "Your son just collapsed at the Science Awards downtown." For a heartbeat, he stood perfectly still, the confidence that usually surrounded him dissolving beneath the cold, fluorescent lights. "Noah?" he asked. his voice suddenly smaller than anyone in the emergency department had ever heard. The nurse nodded quickly. Emergency medical services said he lost consciousness without warning. His pulse became unstable during transport. Whitmore dropped the patient chart onto the counter and rushed toward the ambulance entrance without another word. Behind him, residents hurried to prepare Trauma Room 3, while nurses wheeled in specialized cardiac equipment. Malcolm remained beside Amara's stretcher, watching the hallway empty around the man who had refused to hear him only moments earlier. The rain outside continued beating against the hospital windows like thousands of tiny fingers refusing to be ignored. Amara slowly opened her eyes. Did we do something wrong?" she whispered. Malcolm forced a smile despite the knot tightening inside his chest. "No, Amy, we did everything right." She studied his face for a moment. "You always make that face when you are scared." Malcolm looked away. She knew him too well. Before he could answer, another physician approached their stretcher. Her identification badge read Dr. Emily Carter, Pediatric Cardiology Fellow. She lowered her voice. "I overheard what happened." Malcolm nodded silently. "You mentioned endothelial collapse. Why?" Malcolm hesitated. Most doctors dismissed him before he finished a sentence. But something in her expression invited honesty instead of judgment. "Because my mother died from a rare autoimmune vascular disorder when I was 10, he answered quietly. The doctors treated what they could see. Nobody looked for what was causing everything underneath. Dr. Carter's eyes softened. "You studied medicine after that?" Malcolm gave a tired smile. "Not medicine. Biology first. You cannot fix something until you understand why it breaks." She glanced at the notebook tucked beneath his arm. "May I?" Malcolm handed it to her carefully. As she opened the first page, her eyebrows lifted almost immediately. Every sheet contained meticulous diagrams, protein interaction maps, inflammatory pathways, mathematical models predicting cellular responses, and handwritten references from respected medical journals. Nothing looked copied. Every page reflected independent thinking built on years of relentless study. "You wrote all this?" she asked. Malcolm nodded. "Mostly at night. Who taught you?" "Libraries, public lectures online, research papers. Sometimes professors answer emails if you ask the right questions." Dr. Carter slowly turned another page. "This is graduate-level work." Malcolm shrugged gently. "Knowledge does not ask how old you are." Before she could respond, the ambulance bay doors burst open. Paramedics rolled in Noah Whitmore, 12 years old, unconscious, surrounded by specialists calling out vital signs. Dr. Whitmore ran beside the stretcher, his surgical coat unbuttoned, his face drained of every trace of authority. "Blood pressure?" he demanded, dropping. "Electrocardiogram? Irregular electrical activity, no obvious structural defect. Computed tomography? Clear. Toxicology? Negative." Questions filled the corridor faster than answers. Malcolm watched from across the room as one of the nation's most respected surgeons confronted something he could not immediately explain. He recognized the fear in Whitmore's eyes because he had carried that same fear every day since losing his mother. "Doctor." Carter quietly closed Malcolm's notebook. "Do not leave," she said. "Why?" Malcolm asked. She looked toward Noah's room, then back at the equations covering the notebook pages. "Because I have a feeling this story is not over." Malcolm looked through the glass toward his sister, whose breathing remained shallow but steady under careful observation. Then he glanced toward the opposite trauma room where Noah lay surrounded by physicians searching desperately for answers. 2 children, 2 families, 2 different hallways connected by the same hospital and separated by decisions that could never be undone. Malcolm slowly rested his hand on his notebook. He did not feel anger. He did not even feel satisfaction. What he felt was something much heavier. Somewhere beneath the fear, beneath the disappointment, beneath the exhaustion of carrying responsibilities far beyond his 16 years, a quiet conviction refused to disappear. Biology did not recognize wealth. Disease did not recognize status. Cells never cared about skin color, only people did. The next 40 minutes felt longer than the previous 6 years of Malcolm Brooks's life. Rain continued sliding down the towering glass walls of Johns Hopkins Hospital, while every specialist available gathered outside Noah Whitmore's treatment room. White coats moved quickly through the corridor, carrying tablets, laboratory reports, and imaging results that seemed to generate more questions than answers. Dr. Ethan Whitmore stood at the center of the growing circle, listening as one expert after another admitted the same uncomfortable truth. Electrocardiogram is inconclusive. Magnetic resonance imaging shows no structural abnormality. Genetic screening is negative for the common mutations. Inflammatory markers are elevated, but they do not match any recognized pattern. Each sentence chipped away at the certainty that had defined his entire career. For the first time in decades, the surgeon who had built his reputation solving impossible cases found himself surrounded by uncertainty. Across the hallway, Malcolm sat quietly beside Amara's bed, reviewing her laboratory values displayed on the bedside monitor. He borrowed a hospital pen from a nurse and filled another page of his notebook with observations, drawing arrows between inflammatory pathways and protein interactions while occasionally looking up to check his sister's breathing. Dr. Emily Carter returned, carrying 2 paper cups of hot chocolate from the hospital cafeteria. She handed one to Malcolm without saying a word. He blinked in surprise. "Thank you." She smiled gently. "You look like you have not slept in days." Malcolm wrapped both hands around the warm cup. "I have not." She looked toward Amara. "She is stable for now." Malcolm nodded. Stable is not the same as safe. Dr. Carter understood immediately. There was no panic in his voice, only precise honesty. That alone made him different from almost everyone she had ever met. She sat beside him and lowered her voice. "Can I ask you something?" "Of course." "When Dr. Whitmore dismissed your theory earlier, were you guessing?" Malcolm looked almost offended by the question before catching himself. "No." He opened his notebook to several pages filled with carefully organized research. "My mother developed unexplained vascular inflammation months before anyone recognized it. I spent years reading every published study I could find. There are rare immune responses that imitate common heart conditions during the early stages. Most physicians never encounter them because they affect so few patients." Dr. Carter slowly followed the handwritten diagrams. Every equation connected logically to the next. Every citation referenced respected institutions from Boston, Cleveland, Baltimore, and Stanford. "You built all of this alone?" Malcolm nodded. "Knowledge belongs to everyone willing to earn it." Before she could respond, another physician hurried past, carrying Noah's newest laboratory results. Dr. Whitmore. His inflammatory markers doubled again. Whitmore grabbed the report. His eyes scanned every number before frustration tightened across his face. "Repeat every test." "We already did." "Then run them again." Silence settled over the consultation room. Nobody argued. Nobody had another explanation to offer. Malcolm quietly looked toward the closed treatment room door. Something about the laboratory pattern bothered him. It was familiar, not identical to Amara's condition, but connected somehow. He flipped rapidly through dozens of notebook pages until he reached an older section dated almost 18 months earlier. There, beneath several molecular sketches, one phrase had been circled 3 times in blue ink: hyperinflammatory endothelial cascade with neurological involvement. Malcolm stared at the page. His heartbeat accelerated. He remembered exactly why he had written those notes. During an online biomedical symposium hosted by researchers from the National Institutes of Health, one professor briefly mentioned an experimental hypothesis involving immune signaling failure that could temporarily mimic several unrelated diseases at once. The presentation lasted only 6 minutes before moving to another topic, but Malcolm had spent months expanding the idea on his own. Dr. Carter noticed his expression change. "What is it?" Malcolm hesitated. "I think I have seen something similar before." She leaned closer. "Where?" He tapped the notebook. "Not in a patient. In a theoretical model." She looked back toward Noah's room where senior physicians continued debating possibilities without reaching consensus. "If your model is right," Malcolm interrupted quietly, "it might explain why every test looks normal individually while everything is failing together." Dr. Carter's eyes widened. At that exact moment, Dr. Whitmore emerged from the consultation room looking older than he had an hour earlier. His shoulders sagged beneath the weight of helplessness. His gaze drifted across the hallway and unexpectedly landed on Malcolm. For several silent seconds, neither of them spoke. One carried decades of medical authority that suddenly offered no answers. The other carried a worn notebook filled with ideas nobody had wanted to hear. The distance between them measured less than 30 feet, yet it felt as wide as every assumption that had separated their worlds only an hour before. Dr. Ethan Whitmore remained motionless in the middle of the corridor, his eyes fixed on the worn notebook resting in Malcolm Brooks's hands. The sounds around them faded into a distant blur of rolling carts, soft monitor alarms, and hurried footsteps. For the first time that day, he looked at the 16-year-old without seeing an exhausted teenager in soaked clothes. He saw someone who was completely certain about something no one else had been able to explain. "Doctor," Emily Carter broke the silence. "Doctor, I think you should hear him." Whitmore's jaw tightened. Pride fought with desperation across his face. "Emily, this is not the time for theories. Neither is watching Noah get worse while every protocol fails," she answered calmly. The words landed with unexpected weight. Several physicians standing nearby lowered their eyes. No one challenged her. Whitmore slowly looked back at Malcolm. "You said you recognized this pattern." Malcolm nodded once. "Not exactly the disease, the mechanism." Whitmore crossed his arms. "Explain." Malcolm opened the notebook to the page covered with interconnected molecular diagrams. "Most people are looking at the heart because that is where the symptoms appear. I think they are looking in the wrong place." One of the senior specialists frowned. "Go on." Malcolm pointed to a chain of handwritten notes. "If endothelial signaling begins failing across multiple organ systems at the same time, every department sees a different symptom. Cardiology sees electrical instability. Neurology sees temporary confusion. Immunology sees inflammation. Nobody realizes they are all watching the same event from different angles." The hallway became noticeably quieter. Malcolm continued without raising his voice. "You are treating separate problems that are actually connected by one cascade." Whitmore glanced at the notebook before shaking his head. "That hypothesis has never been clinically validated." Malcolm met his eyes without hesitation. "Neither has the treatment plan that is failing your son." No one spoke. Even the residents who had been whispering moments earlier stood perfectly still. Whitmore slowly inhaled. "Medicine does not work because someone has an interesting idea," Malcolm answered immediately. "Medicine advances because someone has the courage to test one." "Doctor," Carter looked from one face to another. "He is not asking you to replace established treatment. He is asking you to investigate something every current test may be missing." Another physician stepped closer. Dr. Richard Levin, head of immunology, adjusted his glasses before extending his hand toward Malcolm's notebook. "May I see it?" Malcolm handed it over carefully. Dr. Levin turned page after page, his expression becoming more serious with each diagram. "These receptor interaction maps," he murmured. "Where did you find them?" "I developed them from published datasets." "Alone?" "Yes, sir." Levin continued reading until he reached a page filled with mathematical probability models. He looked up slowly. "Dr. Whitmore." Whitmore remained silent. "These calculations are surprisingly rigorous." Whitmore rubbed his forehead. "He is still 16. Levin nodded. "He is. But equations do not know how old the person writing them is." Malcolm quietly closed the notebook after Levin returned it. "I am not asking anyone to believe me because I am smart. I am asking you to verify whether I am wrong." Whitmore stared through the large observation window into Noah's room. His son lay surrounded by monitors while nurses adjusted medications that seemed to accomplish very little. The confident surgeon who had always trusted his own judgment suddenly found himself standing between two impossible choices. Continue following protocols that produced no answers, or consider the work of a teenager he had dismissed less than 2 hours earlier. His phone vibrated. A laboratory update had arrived. He opened it immediately. The newest inflammatory markers had climbed again. Noah's condition was continuing to deteriorate despite every intervention. Whitmore closed his eyes for one brief moment. When he opened them, something inside him had shifted, although not completely. "If this pathway exists," he said quietly, "what would you test next?" Malcolm answered without looking at his notes. "Endothelial activation proteins, complement signaling, and microvascular inflammatory markers that are usually ordered separately." Whitmore frowned. "That panel could take hours." Malcolm shook his head. "Not if you combine the samples. The laboratory already has most of the blood they need." Dr. Carter looked surprised. "He is right." Dr. Levin nodded slowly. "Technically, it is possible." Whitmore remained silent for several seconds before finally speaking. "Order the additional testing." The surrounding physicians immediately began moving. Laboratory requests were rewritten. Nurses hurried toward the elevators. Residents contacted pathology. The hallway came alive again, but this time the movement carried a different energy. Malcolm stood quietly beside his sister's room, watching professionals act on ideas they had refused to hear only an hour earlier. He did not smile. He did not celebrate. He simply looked through the rain-covered hospital windows as evening settled over Baltimore, knowing the hardest part had only just begun. The hospital seemed to breathe differently as the new laboratory orders spread through every department. Phones rang with greater urgency. Specialists who had been preparing to leave for the evening quietly returned to their offices. In the pathology laboratory downstairs, Technicians reorganized their workflow to combine tests that were rarely processed together. Nobody said Malcolm Brooks had changed the direction of the investigation, but everyone could feel it. Upstairs, the lights inside Noah Whitmore's room reflected softly across the polished floor as nurses adjusted intravenous medications and carefully documented every small change. Dr. Ethan Whitmore stood beside his son's bed with folded arms, watching the heart monitor trace uncertain rhythms across the screen. Noah finally stirred, opening his eyes just enough to recognize his father. "Dad?" he whispered weakly. Whitmore immediately leaned closer. "I am here, buddy." Noah managed a faint smile. "Did I miss the awards?" Whitmore forced one back. "Do not worry about that." Noah blinked slowly. "You always tell me science is about finding answers." His father gently squeezed his hand. "It is. Then, you will find mine too." Whitmore nodded, but the confidence in his voice had disappeared. "I will do everything I can." Noah closed his eyes again as the medication eased him back into sleep. The silence that followed felt heavier than any conversation. Across the hallway, Malcolm remained beside Amara, whose fever had finally begun to decrease after supportive treatment and careful monitoring. She looked up at her brother with tired eyes. "The doctors are listening to you now." Malcolm smiled faintly. "They are listening to the evidence." Amara reached toward his notebook. "Mom would be proud." Those 5 words almost broke him. He looked down before she could see the tears gathering in his eyes. "I still wish she were the one explaining all of this instead of me." Amara squeezed his wrist gently. "She taught you to keep helping people." Malcolm nodded without speaking. Their mother had repeated the same sentence throughout her illness. "Knowledge means nothing unless it becomes kindness." The memory lingered as footsteps approached. Dr. Emily Carter returned, carrying several printed laboratory reports. Her breathing was quick from hurrying through the corridors. "The first results are back." Malcolm immediately stood. "What did they find?" She handed him one page while keeping another for herself. His eyes moved rapidly across the numbers. Elevated complement activation, widespread endothelial inflammation, unusual immune signaling, exactly the pattern he had predicted. Dr. Carter looked at him with open disbelief. "Every marker you asked for is abnormal." Malcolm closed his eyes for one quiet second, not from triumph, but relief that there was finally a direction. "Then the pathway exists." She nodded slowly. "Dr. Levin is already comparing your model against the laboratory data." Before either of them could continue, Dr. Richard Levin entered the hallway carrying Malcolm's notebook. Several senior physicians followed behind him. The normally reserved immunologist looked directly at Malcolm. "Young man, there is something I need to ask you." Malcolm stood respectfully. "Yes, sir?" Levin held up one page covered with handwritten molecular diagrams. "These treatment projections at the bottom, they are theoretical?" "Yes." "Have you tested them?" Malcolm shook his head. "Only through computational modeling. I never had access to laboratory equipment." Levin exchanged a long glance with Whitmore, who had just stepped out of Noah's room. "Your predictions match the laboratory findings more closely than our standard differential diagnosis." Whitmore remained silent, his eyes resting on the notebook he had once dismissed without opening. Finally, he spoke. "If your proposed pathway is correct," Malcolm answered carefully, "then treating only the symptoms will never stop the cascade." Whitmore looked down at the floor before asking the question that would have been impossible for him only hours earlier. "What would you do next?" Every conversation in the hallway stopped. Residents paused in the middle of writing notes. Nurses looked up from their medication carts. Malcolm understood the weight of the moment. The most respected surgeon in the hospital was asking a 16-year-old for guidance. He took a slow breath before answering. "I would build a complete biological model using Noah's laboratory values, medical history, and inflammatory timeline. If we understand why the cascade started, we might find where to interrupt it." Dr. Levin nodded almost immediately. "That is exactly what we should be doing." Whitmore looked through the observation window toward his sleeping son, then back toward Malcolm. The pride that had shaped his career was still there, but something stronger had begun pushing against it. Fear had opened a door that certainty never could. For the first time that day, he looked directly into Malcolm's eyes and quietly said, "Show us." Malcolm took a slow breath before opening his notebook on the small consultation table outside Noah Whitmore's room. The overhead lights reflected softly across pages filled with months of handwritten research, each diagram connected by careful arrows, each equation rewritten until every assumption had been challenged. Around the table stood Dr. Ethan Whitmore, Dr. Richard Levin, Dr. Emily Carter, 3 senior residents, 2 laboratory specialists, and the hospital's chief medical officer. Nobody interrupted. Nobody questioned why the youngest person in the room had become the center of the discussion. Malcolm picked up a marker and faced the digital display. "The problem is not only inflammation," he began calmly. "Inflammation is the consequence. We have been treating the consequence instead of the trigger." He sketched a simple chain of circles connected by arrows. Imagine the immune system as thousands of traffic lights across a city. If one light fails, traffic slows down. If every light begins giving conflicting signals at once, the entire city locks itself into chaos. Dr. Carter nodded almost immediately. "System-wide signaling failure." Malcolm smiled slightly. "Exactly." He added another layer to the diagram. "Noah's laboratory results suggest that his endothelial cells are responding to false inflammatory instructions. His body believes it is protecting itself, but the signals never stop." Dr. Levin leaned closer to the screen, which explains why every organ appears affected independently. Malcolm nodded. "Because they are all receiving the same incorrect message." Silence filled the room. The explanation was remarkably simple, yet it connected dozens of disconnected observations that had frustrated every department for hours. Whitmore folded his arms. "Can the cascade be interrupted?" Malcolm paused before answering. "Maybe, but not by suppressing everything at once." He circled another section of the model. "If we reduce the wrong signal while protecting the healthy immune response, the system may reset itself naturally." One resident frowned thoughtfully. "Nobody has published this approach." Malcolm answered honestly. "Not exactly." The resident looked surprised. "Then how did you develop it?" Malcolm glanced down at the notebook. "By asking a different question." Everyone waited. "After my mother died, I stopped asking why doctors missed her illness. I started asking why the disease fooled everyone." The room became perfectly still. Even Whitmore lowered his eyes. Malcolm continued quietly. "For 6 years, I collected every rare inflammatory case I could find. I compared similarities instead of diagnoses. Eventually, patterns began appearing where nobody was looking." Dr. Levin slowly shook his head in disbelief. "You built an independent research database." Malcolm nodded. "Public information only." Whitmore stepped closer to the display. His voice no longer carried the certainty that had once silenced entire operating rooms. "If we follow your model, what are the risks?" Malcolm answered immediately. "The greatest risk is waiting too long." Nobody argued. Outside the consultation room, rain had finally stopped. The evening sky above Baltimore had turned deep blue, and the last sunlight filtered through the enormous hospital windows, painting long, golden reflections across the polished floor. A nurse quietly entered carrying Noah's newest laboratory report. She handed it directly to Whitmore. His eyes scanned every line before moving toward Malcolm. The inflammatory markers had stopped climbing. They had not improved yet, but for the first time they had stopped getting worse. Dr. Carter smiled softly. "The supportive adjustments are buying us time." Malcolm looked at the report. "Then we still have a chance." Whitmore looked at his son through the observation window. Noah slept peacefully, unaware that an entire hospital had begun reorganizing its thinking around ideas created by someone his own age. Whitmore finally turned back toward Malcolm. His voice was almost hesitant. "Earlier today, I judged you before I listened to you." Malcolm remained silent. Whitmore continued, choosing each word carefully. "I cannot change what I already said." Malcolm gently closed his notebook. "No, sir. None of us can change the past." Whitmore lowered his head for a brief moment. "But perhaps we can still change what happens next." Malcolm looked through the glass toward Noah, then toward Amara resting quietly across the hallway. The memory of his mother's gentle voice returned as clearly as if she were standing beside him. Knowledge means nothing unless it becomes kindness. He rested one hand on the notebook before meeting Whitmore's eyes again. "Then let us stop proving who was right," he said softly. "Let us start helping the children who still have tomorrow." The consultation room transformed into a temporary research laboratory before midnight. Whiteboards covered with molecular pathways surrounded Malcolm Brooks, while physicians moved between computer terminals comparing his biological model against Noah Whitmore's laboratory data in real time. Coffee cups sat forgotten beside stacks of medical journals as every department contributed pieces of information that had previously seemed unrelated. The atmosphere no longer felt like a hierarchy. It felt like a team chasing the same answer. Malcolm stood quietly near the display, adjusting one final variable in his handwritten model. "Run the endothelial response against the inflammatory timeline again," he said. A laboratory analyst typed rapidly before the screen refreshed with a new graph. Every colored line shifted until they suddenly aligned almost perfectly. Doctor, Richard Levin leaned closer, disbelief spreading across his face. That cannot be right. Another analyst repeated the calculation using an independent system. The second graph appeared. It matched the first almost exactly. Dr. Emily Carter slowly covered her mouth. It reproduces. One resident whispered, 100%? The analyst shook his head. 98.7% predictive accuracy. Silence filled the room. Nobody celebrated. Scientists understood what that number meant. Malcolm's theoretical model was explaining Noah's disease more accurately than every existing diagnostic pathway they had used throughout the day. Dr. Levin turned toward Malcolm. How many times did you test this simulation? Malcolm answered honestly. More than 3,000 revisions. Several physicians exchanged stunned glances. 3,000? Malcolm nodded. Every night after homework, sometimes until sunrise. Dr. Carter looked at him with quiet admiration. You were preparing for a patient you had never met. Malcolm gave a small smile. I was preparing for the patient nobody expected. Whitmore remained motionless near the back of the room, watching the teenager he had dismissed transform confusion into clarity with nothing more than a notebook, patience, and relentless curiosity. Every confident assumption he had carried for years seemed painfully small, compared with the humility standing only a few feet away. A nurse entered, carrying Noah's newest clinical update. His oxygen levels are stabilizing. Every head turned toward her. His heart rhythm is becoming more regular. Whitmore stepped forward immediately. Without changing the medication. Yes, doctor. Since the adjusted supportive protocol began, Malcolm quietly studied the updated monitor readings displayed on the screen. The cascade is slowing. Levine looked at him. You predicted that too, Malcolm nodded. Because the body finally stopped receiving conflicting signals, Whitmore walked into Noah's room accompanied by Malcolm, Dr. Carter, and Dr. Levin. The lighting inside was softer now, and the constant alarm tones that had echoed through the evening had faded into steady electronic beeps. Noah slowly opened his eyes as his father approached. Dad? Whitmore smiled through exhausted eyes. I am here. Noah noticed Malcolm standing beside the window. Are you the science guy? Malcolm laughed quietly. Something like that. Noah smiled weakly. You have cool notebooks. Malcolm held one up. You can borrow them someday. Noah nodded faintly before drifting back to sleep. The room grew still again. Whitmore looked toward Malcolm. He likes science more than baseball. Malcolm smiled. Then he asks good questions. Whitmore stared at his sleeping son for a long moment before speaking. I almost ignored the one person who had the answer because I decided who you were before I ever listened. Malcolm remained silent. There was no anger left in his expression, only calm compassion. Whitmore continued quietly. You walked into this hospital carrying your sister and a lifetime of knowledge. I saw only your clothes. Malcolm looked toward Amara through the observation window across the hallway. She was resting peacefully, wrapped in a warm blanket while reading one of the children's books a volunteer had left earlier that evening. My mother used to tell me that people see with their eyes long before they learn to see with their hearts, Malcolm said softly. Sometimes it takes pain to teach the difference. Whitmore lowered his head. No one spoke for several seconds. Outside the hospital windows, the rain clouds had finally broken apart, revealing a clear night sky above Baltimore where scattered stars reflected against the glass. The city lights shimmered below like quiet reminders that hope often returned one small light at a time. Behind them, Noah's monitor continued tracing steady, confident rhythms across the screen, and for the first time since the ambulance had arrived, the sound no longer carried fear. It sounded like tomorrow. Morning sunlight streamed through the eastern windows of Johns Hopkins Hospital, replacing the cold glow of fluorescent lights with a quiet warmth that nobody had noticed during the endless night. Nurses changing shifts smiled when they looked toward Noah Whitmore's room because the monitor now displayed calm, consistent rhythms instead of unpredictable alarms. Laboratory reports arriving one after another confirmed what everyone had hoped to see. The inflammatory markers continued falling. His oxygen levels remained stable. The dangerous cascade that had threatened every major organ was finally retreating. Dr. Emily Carter gently closed the latest chart and looked toward Malcolm Brooks. It is working. Malcolm released a slow breath he had been holding for hours. His body is remembering how to heal. Dr. Richard Levin smiled for the first time since the emergency began. Medicine helped, but understanding made the medicine possible. Malcolm quietly nodded. Sometimes the body only needs someone to stop sending it the wrong message. Across the room, Noah slowly opened his eyes and noticed his father asleep in the chair beside the bed, still wearing the same wrinkled surgical coat from the previous afternoon. Noah smiled faintly before whispering, "Dad." Whitmore woke immediately. "Good morning, buddy." Noah looked around the room. "Everybody looks happier today." Whitmore laughed softly, relief filling every word. "That is because you decided to scare an entire hospital." Noah gave a weak grin before looking toward Malcolm standing near the window. "Did your idea help?" Malcolm walked closer with his notebook tucked beneath one arm. "A lot of people help." Noah shook his head gently. "But you started it." Malcolm smiled. "Then promise me something." "What?" "Keep asking questions. Curious people change the world." Noah nodded seriously. "I will." A few minutes later, Whitmore stepped into the hallway and quietly closed the door behind him. Malcolm was sitting beside Amara, helping her finish breakfast, while explaining why pancakes always tasted better after difficult days. Amara laughed softly. "That is not science." Malcolm shrugged playfully. "Not every truth comes from a laboratory." Whitmore watched the brother and sister for several silent seconds before walking toward them. His footsteps were slower than usual, almost hesitant. Malcolm stood respectfully as Whitmore approached. Neither of them spoke immediately. Finally, Whitmore looked directly into Malcolm's eyes. "I owe you more than gratitude." Malcolm answered gently, "Your son is recovering. That is enough." Whitmore slowly shook his head. "No, it is not." He looked down at the polished floor before continuing. "Yesterday I looked at your skin, your clothes, and your circumstances before I looked at your character or your knowledge. I allowed assumptions to guide decisions that should have been guided only by compassion and evidence." Malcolm remained silent. Whitmore continued, his voice carrying the weight of genuine regret. "You had every reason to walk away after what happened to your family. Instead, you stayed. You shared everything you knew. You helped save my son." Malcolm glanced toward Noah's room. He never chose the mistakes adults make. Whitmore's eyes became noticeably brighter. "Why?" Malcolm looked thoughtfully through the hospital window where the morning sun reflected across Baltimore Harbor in the distance. "Because if I let someone else's prejudice decide who deserves kindness, then prejudice wins twice." The hallway became completely still. Nurses paused while organizing charts. Residents quietly stopped walking. Nobody had intended to listen, yet everyone found themselves standing in respectful silence. Dr. Carter smiled softly, knowing she had just heard a sentence she would remember for the rest of her career. Whitmore reached out his hand. For one brief moment, Malcolm looked at it, then accepted the handshake without hesitation. It was firm, equal, and free of pride. "Thank you," Whitmore said quietly. Malcolm answered with the same calm voice that had carried him through every difficult moment. "Just promise me something." Whitmore nodded. "Anything." Malcolm looked toward Amara, then back at the surgeon. "The next frightened family that walks through these doors should never have to wonder whether they will be heard." Whitmore held his gaze before answering. "They never will. Not while I am here." Sunlight spread farther across the hallway, warming the marble floor where fear had ruled only hours before. For the first time since Malcolm and Amara entered the hospital, the building no longer felt divided by titles, wealth, or appearances. It felt united by a simple truth that every person in those corridors now understood. Compassion had succeeded where assumption had failed. 1 year later, the auditorium inside Johns Hopkins Hospital was filled beyond capacity. Physicians, nurses, medical students, researchers, and local families occupied every seat while sunlight poured through the tall windows overlooking Baltimore Harbor. The atmosphere carried none of the urgency that had once echoed through those same hallways. Instead, there was quiet anticipation. At the center of the stage stood a simple wooden podium beside a newly unveiled bronze plaque. The inscription read, "The Amara Brooks Fellowship for Translational Biomedical Innovation." In the front row, Amara Brooks, now healthy and smiling, adjusted the navy blue ribbon around her neck while teasing her older brother. "Do not trip when they call your name." Malcolm laughed softly. "That is your biggest concern?" She grinned. "Absolutely. You are brilliant, but you are still clumsy." Their father, James Brooks, sat beside them wearing the same worn suit he had saved for every important family milestone. It was carefully pressed, even though the fabric showed its age. Pride shone in his eyes more brightly than any expensive jacket ever could. "Your mother would have loved this day," he whispered. Malcolm looked toward the empty seat they always left beside them during meaningful moments. He smiled gently. "I think she is already here." The ceremony began as the hospital president welcomed everyone before inviting Dr. Ethan Whitmore to the podium. The room grew silent. A year earlier, people had applauded him because of his reputation. Today, they listened because they knew he had changed. Whitmore looked across the audience before taking a slow breath. "There was a time when I believed experience alone made someone worthy of being heard," he began. "I believed authority guaranteed wisdom. I was wrong. No one moved." His words carried the weight of someone no longer hiding behind titles. 1 year ago, a frightened family walked through our emergency department asking for help. Instead of listening carefully, I judged them too quickly. I allowed assumptions to stand where compassion should have stood. In doing so, I nearly failed 2 remarkable children. The auditorium remained perfectly still. Several young residents quietly lowered their eyes. Whitmore continued. "The person who changed this hospital forever was not wearing a white coat. He was wearing a rain-soaked hoodie, carrying a notebook filled with hope, discipline, and years of quiet study." He turned toward Malcolm. He reminded every one of us that truth does not belong to status, wealth, age, or appearance. Truth belongs to those willing to seek it with humility. Applause began slowly before growing into a standing ovation that filled the auditorium. Malcolm remained seated, visibly uncomfortable with the attention. Amara laughed softly. "You cannot hide now." Whitmore smiled and extended one hand toward the stage. "Malcolm Brooks, would you please join me?" Malcolm walked forward with the same notebook tucked beneath his arm. The cover had become worn from another year of constant use, but he still carried it everywhere. Whitmore waited until Malcolm stood beside him before speaking again. "Today, I have the privilege of announcing that Malcolm Brooks has accepted a full research fellowship sponsored jointly by Johns Hopkins Hospital and the National Institutes of Health. His work on immune signaling pathways will continue with the support of physicians who now proudly call him their colleague." The applause returned even louder than before. Malcolm stepped toward the microphone, looking briefly at his father, his sister, and the doctors who had once doubted him. "Thank you," he said quietly. "But this fellowship should never be remembered because of me. It should be remembered because every patient deserves to be seen before they are judged, heard before they are dismissed, and treated with equal dignity the moment they walk through a hospital door." He paused as his eyes rested on the plaque bearing Amara's name. Science becomes extraordinary only when it serves humanity. The room fell into a deep, peaceful silence before another wave of applause echoed through the hall. After the ceremony ended, families slowly drifted outside into the warm spring afternoon. Cherry blossoms moved gently in the breeze along the hospital courtyard while children laughed near the fountain. Malcolm and Amara walked side by side beneath the blooming trees, saying very little. The notebook rested comfortably beneath Malcolm's arm, and the afternoon sun reflected across its worn cover. Behind them, through the hospital entrance, Dr. Whitmore watched quietly with a grateful smile before returning inside to greet the next family waiting for care. This time, he welcomed them before asking a single question, and the doors closed softly as hope walked in ahead of fear.